Great. So it's really nice to be here. Fun to come and see this group. I haven't been to one of these before or known much about it till my friend Nicole, who's a part of CRES, thought it could be a good idea to come here and share some of my knowledge with you all. I did a PhD in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon, looking at controlled electric vehicle charging and sort of the implications of different charging strategies on the emissions that were generated by the power system as a whole in order to add that load to the grid, and then the life cycle emissions of those vehicles on different strategies compared to conventional cars. This was using 2013 data, looking mostly at PJM, which is the mid-Atlantic region with Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and some other states. So pretty coal heavy at the time. So the EVs actually didn't look that great, but I managed to spin my results around in an interesting enough way in my interview with Tesla to get a job there anyway, even though I was showing that Tesla's is the worst car in my thesis, but I didn't show them that slide. But I worked at Tesla on stationary storage, looking at mostly grid scale storage, operating in wholesale markets in the US, but also looking globally as well with the Powerwall product of different sizing of that product to fit different, what it would mean for different tariffs and how much money people could make having one of those systems at their house. At the time, that meant really only coming out ahead. They were more expensive back then in Australia and Hawaii, but it was interesting work. And then worked for quite a while for a company in Boulder called Ascend Analytics, where I built up the battery side of the business with a optimization valuation platform and then a bidding platform for as the large-scale storage actually started operating in wholesale markets, mostly in Texas and California. And then about 3 years ago, just under 3 years ago, I moved to Wood Mackenzie. And now I get to look more broadly across the whole world, all the markets, all the technology evolution with a team of about 15 analysts. So we get to look at a lot, but we don't get into every single detail. So I'm here to give you a wide global view of storage in the market, focusing mostly on the grid scale side. We'll get into a little bit of detail in the US, but we look at a lot of different aspects. So if you have questions on certain parts, we can get into that in the discussion part at the end as well. So I do have a very quantitative background, and we are a data-based company. We cover all the energy sectors in the world. It started as a North Sea oil company, so our headquarters are in Edinburgh, and now we have coverage across oil, gas, coal, even in mining, as well as power and renewables. So we have a lot of data, I have a lot of graphs. We might not go through all of them, but I'll try to get to the especially interesting ones and try to get some pared down to the key points here. All right, so I know we're going to talk about the role storage plays in the energy transition, but I do want to start with sort of the context of where we sit more broadly, zooming out globally of maybe where we're forecasting that we're going versus where we maybe want it to be and where we hoped we were going when we were coming out of the Paris Accords. There is a lot of positive movement across the world. So before we look at storage, just looking at some of our sister technologies, we see electrification increasing around the world. We see the sales of EVs increasing. That skyrocketing line is China, as Martin mentioned. We see growth still across solar and wind around the world. Again, a really large section of that in China. And batteries have been a bit slower to scale to the same volumes just because it's a newer technology to get to a price point where it made sense. But we have seen tremendous growth globally in battery storage over the last several years here, especially picking up, since 2022 and years where we've doubled or nearly doubled. So that's all been really good. But when we think about that fact that we were trying to get some of these country pledge levels on emissions or a net zero scenario on emissions, we're not really hitting those numbers. We've seen mixed policies around the world. It certainly hasn't helped what's happened here in our country. Certain parts have been more expensive than people were hoping. there needed to be a lot more investment more quickly into new energy supply. So for example, I put this example here in our net zero scenario. That assumes that we double what we're investing in energy supply by 2050, getting to 3 trillion a year. And we would need a carbon price between $150 and $200, where globally now we're at about 25, and of course, for most of the US, there is no carbon price. So increasing the level of storage deployment along with the rest of the renewables is really key if we want to try to get back on one of these lines that we were targeting earlier. And could still get to with aggressive policies and investments around the world. And when we look across global markets, there's a lot of factors that are going to drive differences in different regions. Some of it, based on these policy choices and the economics at play in different areas. So on the left, we're looking at operating gas plants. So this is not talking about the initial investment to build a gas plant, but just having mainly the fuel cost for operations, the carbon cost on top where that's relevant, and any maintenance as well, although the bulk of it there is on fuel. And of course, gas is very expensive in Europe, or they're trying to get off Russian gas, and they're importing more LNG from us. We have some of the cheapest gas. And so that's influenced some of the choices that we've been making, right, as we exploited the Marcellus Shale and have had, until maybe this week with the cold weather, some very low prices on gas. That is going to be changing going forward, right? There's going to be rising gas prices for us as well through time, especially given some of the dynamics of gas build-out that we'll talk about a little later. And gas is something that I think about a lot, actually, as a storage analyst, just because it's the main competitor right now in most markets for flexible capacity to balance renewables. And then we can also see, this is true not just for storage, but for wind and solar too, like how much more we're paying in the United States compared to other countries. Some of that is direct costs that we have added ourselves through tariffs for things that we import, either the cells or the components for the cells if we're going to try to make them here going forward, and other materials. It's also the higher cost of labor that we have here for installing the systems and now manufacturing more of the systems as we try to incentivize that manufacturing to happen here, and some of the costs. Having the ITC was great to support all this renewable build out. There are costs associated with having to do that kind of financing process to get that tax credit. There are whole institutions that are out there providing, because the developers who are making the projects don't have tax burden, right? They don't own enough things that they're paying taxes on enough income that they can take advantage of it directly. So there's a whole industry of people financing these projects, having to justify to them that the project makes sense. So some of that we might relax some good sides of the changes in policy that are currently causing us more headaches, but could eventually help some of these higher costs. And then in the IRA, there are labor requirements that obviously have their good points, but also makes it more expensive. So various tensions worldwide on this. This goal of having lower electricity prices is something that all countries are going to be struggling with as we see gas prices go up worldwide. But we in the United States have really policy goals that are in conflict with each other that the Trump administration says at least that they are pursuing, which is trying to keep electricity affordable. We are having affordability crisis kind of across the board, but energy is definitely one of the things people are paying more for. Again, reviving the manufacturing here, but that inherently is in conflict with keeping things cheaper because it's more expensive to make things here. And then if we make it more expensive to have energy here, that also hinders some of the build out for data center build out. We'll talk about what that data center demand is looking like because it's such an important driver for this country in a little bit. But we say that we want to be a leader and not get left behind by China on that front, and that's going to require a lot of investment in facilities and energy to support them. But the more electricity these data centers consume, then the more cost pressure that can put on regular electricity consumers as well. So why is storage such a critical part of the picture as we try to get back on a better path with higher levels of renewables and reducing carbon emissions? Because of course, storage by itself is not producing electricity carbon-free, it's just storing it for later. So as we increase the level of renewables on the grid, we make it increasingly hard to operate because grids were designed for what we had before, which was these thermal power plants that were meant to meet load. Load wasn't changing that much because there weren't renewables behind the meter. So you were forecasting load on an hourly basis and moving around your coal and gas fleets to meet that demand. As we get more and more renewables, we get to more days where you get to the level where with whatever gas plants or other thermal generators you had to have on for the highest load of the day, now that there's enough solar coming online that they might be below the minimum level that they can operate, and you have to turn them off, and that incurs costs, and you have to plan around it, and you may not know exactly how much wind or solar might show up that day. So that starts to create a lot of volatility in energy prices and challenges in operating the grid. And then there can be days where you might get to the point where you turn off all of those assets altogether, and now suddenly you have a problem where you might be hard to balance the grid, and you lose inertia. So you had all of these big thermal generators that are spinning magnets, and they can help make sure that if there's small fluctuations in the load, that the frequency stays right at that 60 hertz that we keep here. And if you just have renewables at some point in the day, you can deal with it without thermal assets, but you have to have planned for that, and you have to have required that the inverters that are paired with those renewables have storage with them, and that then they're set up with the software to respond appropriately. Yes. So we can see some of the impacts of what happens at these higher renewable levels on prices. So before we just exclusively talk about the US, here's an example from Europe. So the 100% line here is if solar power was able to get the average price of electricity across the day, what that would look like. And this is dividing the year into, showing the monthly pattern here through the year, or every 2 months through the year here. And so because enough solar comes online, it lowers electricity, because solar is going to bid in for free, or in Europe or in the US, renewables will actually bid in at a negative value into power markets, because they're actually willing to pay some amount of money to keep generating, because they either generate RECs, renewable energy credits, or wind and solar now, if it came in time under the IRA, can get the production tax credit. So there's wind farms bidding negative $39 in the Great Plains part of the country. And so, and then even in Europe, though, they get negative prices as well, because again, there's this cost to turn off thermal generators. And if enough renewables come online, they have to turn those generators off, but they're gonna need them back later. Then they're gonna bid negative pricing, trying to stay on for those higher prices that come on later and not incur the cost of shutting off. And so with negative pricing and just lowered average pricing, you see that the more, of course, Spain is the worst here, because they have built out a ton of solar, having been actually have nice solar resources, unlike Germany that also built a ton, but doesn't have that great of solar resources. It's kind of like Maine for solar, but seeing really strong impacts where the more solar comes online, the more all of these solar plants are getting lower returns in the electricity market. And if they didn't, so all these companies that are building these plants come to a company like ours to ask for a price curve looking out till 2050, 2060, and we run a big model and we tell them what the price is going to be. But if it wasn't low enough, then some of these companies could be in trouble and not able to build the next project. So and also just means that solar that comes online, then some of it is going to get turned off and curtailed because it can't be used by the load at that time. And so we start to see more and more this evidence of low solar capture and curtailment of wind and solar, meaning that these resources aren't aren't being used as optimally as possible. From the power price side for storage as well is sort of a signal to see where it's going to be needed in markets. We talk a lot about TBs, which is the top and bottom hours of the day. This is showing TB1s, because we're looking at 1 hour at a time, the difference in price for a given day between the lowest hour and the top hour here. The green is when the battery would charge, and the yellow is when the battery would discharge. This is, we often look at it as just a simple financial metric, so it isn't accounting for, sometimes there are contracts or things that account for the physical losses, but often we're just like measuring roughly how much money is there in the market for batteries by looking at the spreads through the day. Either this is, representative of what a 1 hour battery could do. In Europe, they're often going up to 2 hours. In the US, mainly 4 hour storage is being installed, except Texas where it's 2. So you'd look at maybe the bottom 4 and the top 4 hours. And that spread in prices is really showing how much economic incentive there is for storage right now in those wholesale markets that the utility scale storage is taking part in. And then in the graph, we're showing how that has been changing. So that average delta in prices on a daily basis, but averaged across the year, is higher for the first half of 2025 compared to 2024. And that's because renewables generally are increasing across Europe. We see a little bit of exception there in some of the Nordic countries where they have enough hydro to balance that out. But this is a trend that we see as we increase renewable penetration. We expect this volatility to go up. There are a lot of other factors that are affecting the volatility of prices, and Texas, which was one of the markets that had the highest spreads for batteries, had some pretty bad years last year and the year before that companies are trying to reconcile with the contracts they signed and the financial agreements they made. And that's, there's lots of factors tied to gas price as well as the penetration of the storage relative to how much solar and wind has been installed, and how generally short the system is and how it falls on bad weather days. But we do see that there is this underlying trend of increasing volatility in the prices with more renewables, and so that's showing how valuable storage can be in one way. There's other services it can provide too, but to the grid and creating what we need in the balance of load and demand. And then, of course, with climate change, we're also seeing a lot more extreme weather scenarios worldwide, and we can see that a variety of resources will help provide resiliency to the grid, right? When we had Winter Storm Uri in Texas, the gas plants couldn't perform, but if storage had planned and charged ahead of time, it could ride through some of it. Of course, there were outages for days that the 1 and 2 hour systems in Texas couldn't manage, and so that's where you need longer duration storage to get through some of these events, and we'll talk sort of how we see that evolving through time a little later. But storage can be one part of the picture of building the resiliency of the grid in this evolving situation where we have more and more extreme weather events. Okay, and then I did want to show a little bit about load growth because it is so much a part of the conversation for storage and all renewable outlooks now. It's sort of definitely, it's not part of going towards the energy transition we were all hoping for exactly, but it is helping keep the pipelines of renewable projects and storage projects alive right now, even as they face some pretty big changes in how they're going to have to get those projects financed and the costs that are going to be associated with those projects. So we're in an environment where up until last year or so, we had extremely flat demand for about 20 years, even as GDP continued to grow. So there was a period earlier that we're showing, before 2025, 2005, where we needed to increase our electricity use in order to increase the economic output of the country. And then we got to a point where we were getting more efficient on using energy, but still able to grow GDP. But that has all begun to change through the growth of large load. And when we talk about large load, we're talking about all categories, including manufacturing, as that's come back, making a difference. But definitely the biggest piece is from data centers. And so that's something that we track closely. And we see a huge amount of announced projects. But you can also see that there is a very large difference between capacity that people say that they want to make or announce a project coming online someday or put in a request to some load queue for coming online eventually versus what they're actually actively developing, putting resources towards and progressing along. So there is both a tremendous change in the trajectory of load happening now compared to the last 20 years, but also a lot of overhype on what will be coming. So both things are kind of simultaneously true, and it means there's also a lot of uncertainty on what the exact final number will be. Of course, we have to make numbers anyway, so I'll show you what we're currently saying. But so just looking a little bit more at how rapidly this is expanding, this is just how many projects are announced each month. And so that is linearly growing, where we're seeing, 435 megawatts more announcements per month, each month. So it is just pretty crazy and a lot of data and projects to track. But some of it will happen. And so one thing we do is talk to the utilities and see who is committed to actually allowing these projects to come online. For renewable, utility scale, renewable, and battery projects, you enter interconnection queues that the larger markets run. Like, we're not in a market, so you have to talk to Excel if you want to bring a project online here. But in our neighbor over the border in Kansas, where they're part of SPP, there's a broader group of states that together operate a wholesale market, and you enter their queue to get a project online. Those queues have been very slow. They're working on making them better. It's been a kind of long, hard road. It's still very much in progress. And then now we have all these loads trying to come online. They talk to the individual utilities. It's normally a totally different process that haven't been linked up. But there are utilities out there, both within the integrated wholesale markets and places where they're vertically integrated, like here in Colorado, where they are committing to letting these loads come online. They obviously want to bring that economic opportunity to their areas and the additional load on their system, because that's how they make money, is a return on new investments and load. And so that's where we get that committed number. And then there's others that are like in talks with the utilities about coming online. And so we see that it's nearly 25% of the current peak load of additional loads that are likely to come online. So although this is a very small percent of all of the data centers that people are talking about, there are hundreds of gigawatts of data centers in the queue to come on, like connect as load in Texas alone. So this is a small percent of what people are contemplating across the country. It is still a very significant amount of new load. And looking at like one example, so APS is Arizona Public Service. So this is what they're dealing with. So the graph on the left is power. So what the highest amount of demand they might see at any point could be, and the one on the right would be, how much energy they have to generate through the year to meet those loads. But that orange line that is arcing up here, that's the very largest load category that they have and what they're forecasting now. And so this is, a very tough problem for all these utilities. They've had 20 years where they're like dealing with how they should incorporate energy efficiency and how they're going to get the PUC to let them earn a return on that. And now we have to build assets again, and we have to plan for how to let these loads interconnect and become part of the grid. So there's lots to talk about with that, but I bring it up here as just a core driving part of the storage market right now, where this is a reason as well that projects that people had might still get built, even though the economics might have gotten a little more shaky as they now face more tariffs on the storage or have to decide whether or not they're really going to get ITC anymore, if they're going to get a fiat compliant system or not. And then there's another piece that actually starts to look a little bit like what we were talking about with renewables, where the data centers now, we had data centers before that we were building that were sort of the backbone of the internet. They were running websites and having the databases for hospitals or whatever, and they needed to have 99.999% uptime. They needed to have full backup of diesel generators for the entire power, and they were expected to run at a really high load factor pretty constantly. And so they were both, pretty unsuitable for a 4-hour battery to deal with, but also pretty stable in load. And now we're looking at loads that are ramping very quickly, perhaps even more quickly than some of the renewables that we have been trying to balance before. And some of that is price responsive ones, like Bitcoin miners or others that are only going to run the processing when it's economically advantageous, and then they'll turn down. And so they're kind of, if the price is high, it means there's a lot of other demand on the system, and them ramping down might actually be helpful. But some of them are training data centers where they're just ramping up whenever they decide they want to train a new model, and then they're ramping back down. And so that's causing just big swings in the grid that it has to deal with, like it would from a big wind farm stopping because the wind stopped. But potentially much, much quicker, where they could be ramping. We're building out a gigawatt-sized data centers all the time now. Those are as big as an entire nuclear power plant, and they could ramp 60% of their load in less than a second. As I mentioned, we track gas very closely because it's the biggest competitor that's being considered right now, and certainly one that's maybe facing an easier time on regulations and permitting than some of the renewable and storage projects. But it has also gotten very expensive. Where it used to be in the mid to low teens per kilowatt to install, we're now seeing $2,200 per kilowatt or more. So it's, so I mean $1,400 to $2,200 per kilowatt. So that's makes it not as good an option. It's also that there isn't enough gas turbines being built in the world that we can do this 170 gigawatts of new additions all on gas anyway. From what we project that we will have with the new additions that are planned, that are much more aggressive now than what we were looking at a couple of years ago when we were modeling out all these different power regions. We're not going to meet this demand growth with just gas. So that is. So there's definitely good news there that we're supporting the build out of renewables and storage to meet this new load, but of course it's adding new load which we are partially meeting by gas, and so that is not helping us get back on one of those trajectories towards more net zero emissions. So that's some of the demand side of why we're going to keep building a lot of renewables and storage. And then in terms of another reason why storage is gotten to be such a large market in the world is just how much the technology has evolved recently and how much lower prices are getting. So this has really become, the first projects I worked on at Tesla were all either Panasonic, which is Japanese, or LG Korean cells. Now for stationary storage, basically, until we change the rules here, basically everything that was getting installed for stationary storage was coming from China in terms of the cells. So this is showing the integrators, which are the companies that put the cells together into systems and then sell them to developers to be built into these large-scale projects. But Tesla was using CATL cells, which is a Chinese company, and 7 of these are Chinese companies using Chinese cells directly as well. So it's just a market really dominated by Chinese players who built out massive scale, where we have 1,000 gigawatt hours globally just for ESS, but it's only about 25% of the market share of total cells when you look at the EV picture. And so this huge scale of manufacturing has really brought down prices. So on all the forecast slides, I did have to remove all the numbers since this is a public presentation. Just showing some percents here and the trends, but of course, feel free to follow up if you want access to numbers. happy to talk about our offerings at a later date. So here you can really see part of also what is driving the pricing coming down through time going forward as well. We continue to have massive build out of manufacturing, which is both, continuing to see price falling in terms of the cost of making them with the manufacturing efficiency, but it's also just a huge amount of competition where so much has been built, especially in China, that they're really competing with each other and trying to get the edge to get market share and keeping margins extremely low. Pricing in China for the cells is half as much as here. So they're especially competing within China, but then they were supplying this entire market, so they are competing here too. It's just this was a market where they were able to get more margin. That becomes more of a question now, what they want to do going forward as they try to still potentially be a player in the US market despite the foreign entities of concern restrictions on cells here for getting the ITC tax credit. So they have a couple of choices, and we think that there's enough capacity here pursuing some of those choices that it will help keep competition here a little more reasonable and keep our pricing under control, even as we've put all these heavy restrictions on. They can restructure what Canadian Solar has done, where they're already a public company, so they didn't have as much direct Chinese ownership anyway, but they are separating out parts of the company so that they think that they will qualify. There's always the potential that the government, though, names specific entities that will not count for getting the investment tax credit, regardless of what restructuring they do. CATL and BYD, I believe, are on the list for similar list for the DoD procurements. They could just sell at a price similar to what they sell at in China, plus tariffs, plus shipping. That actually comes out pretty similarly to the cost of cells manufactured here that get 40% tax credit. That just gives you an idea of the massive efficiencies and lower cost of manufacturing in China compared to here. So we can make them here, get a 40% tax credit, and those companies are getting the production tax credit on their side to build those factories. And then that's the same base as the rock bottom China price. So that will, if we get enough players willing to sell at those price levels, then we will have some competition for the domestic manufacturing here. In addition to just manufacturing efficiencies and extreme competition, there's also continued learning on the technology itself and packaging it up more efficiently. They're making larger containers in terms of how much megawatt hours they can pack into one container and ship over. Some of that isn't without increasing the weight, so we're starting to hit some limits on transit of these containers and people having to weigh if it's really worth those extra upfront charges of shipping to get it there. For what you sort of save on lower site build out and cost of construction. But continuing to see those efficiencies and all together, even though we do see lithium markets tightening, there's certainly some tightening right now that should resolve. And then again, at the end of the decade, sort of longer term on where we look at the supply and demand balance on the mining, some tightening in the market. But overall, we're still just seeing the pressure downward on pricing for storage. And that's a little different of a picture than on some of the others like solar, that they're doing some stricter controls on the competition within China and how much they're willing to export, plus all of our fun tariffs that keep popping up in various parts that are making that get a little more expensive. So we can see how that pressure has evolved over the last years. If you look before 2020, these prices were even much, much higher, but we're still seeing significant declines through last year, and that will continue. You can see how much lower China is than the rest of the world, as I mentioned, just pricing very cheap there with it, really intense competition, plus the build out in China is very large. So there's efficiencies there, but it's also was originally for mandated storage that had to be installed with renewable projects. And it's unclear how much those projects were really ever going to operate. So there might have been some cost savings there as well. But going forward, those projects will have to be price responsive, just like the rest of the world. So we can put this to compare to other assets always gets complicated, and my favorite way of saying what the optimal mix should be would be putting it all in an optimization model, and we put in all the different costs and run it across load, across different weather scenarios. That takes a very, very long time to solve, and our clients mostly just want to look at a simple comparison. So we use LCOE, even though it's a very imperfect metric for storage. This is taking the cost of installing the system, the upfront cost of installing the system, the cost through the life of operating the system and levelizing them back to today, and then dividing it by the megawatt hours generated by the system through life. Of course, storage doesn't generate electricity, but to do it like other assets, we divide it by some number of megawatt hours that we say it's going to discharge, typically 1 cycle a day, to make this a simple metric. That's what a lot of the warranties are designed around. Some systems will really cycle less because that's what the price is incentivized on that day. Some will cycle more, but to make this simple metric, that's what we do. For comparing it to gas, we need to do a similar division, and so you're always making a choice about what that megawatt hours on the bottom is. For single cycle gas turbines, I believe we assume that they run 20% of the time, right? Those are often peaking units, so they aren't gonna run every hour of the day. And in the combined cycle as well, I think we do 50%. They're not normally totally base load running all the time. And then this is 4-hour storage. So storage looks really good here, but it does depend on a lot of those assumptions of how often you're gonna run the gas plant and if you really needed longer than 4-hour storage for that circumstance, right? You couldn't run the entire grid on solar plus 4-hour storage. You would be installing a lot of extra storage, but you also, you wouldn't run it pure, you would build more things anyway to get to the optimal mix. So this is a simple way of looking at it, but it is showing just how expensive gas has gotten under those new prices for turbines. Because before we were looking at the beginning, we looked at just the operating cost. So if you start incorporating that $2,200 a kilowatt in, $2,400 a kilowatt, then it gets much more expensive. Okay, so first, we're going to look at how much storage we just built, and then we'll look at how that's evolving through time. Last year, the growth rate slowed a little bit globally, but we did pass this big milestone of 100 gigawatts installed globally for the first time. And then we put the years here for some of those other technologies. You can sort of see storage is coming after renewables as this balancing function once those renewables get high enough penetration, so it is, and storage got cheap enough. So it did come a little later, but we are getting up there in scale. And most of this was utility scale storage. You can see from this middle bar in the green, and a lot of it was in China. And as you can see, this yellow bar. But it was definitely a very big year for storage. This is all types of energy storage except pumped hydro. But the vast majority is LFP lithium-ion batteries. As we talk about the numbers across the world, this is sort of how we are currently forecasting things out. There's some markets where very little to none has been installed to date, and so we still have large regions that we sort of aggregate into rest ofs. But we do have 45 markets around the world that we look at individually. And we have analysts spread across a bunch of these regions talking to players in the area, and we collect the data of all the projects that are in development and then forecast out 10 years, looking at policies and economics and other factors as well through that period. As we look towards the end of the period, we're looking at what is the build out that's going to support the load through the next years, through 2050, 60, where our power teams model prices. So looking out over the next 10 years, that picture in China doesn't change, although their build out is going to slow dramatically this year too. As I mentioned, they went through, sort of coincidentally, China and the US went through massive policy changes at the same time, although they're very different changes. They are trying to open up their market to competitive operations in their wholesale electricity. So that's why they got rid of that requirement that anyone who brought online a renewable project had to show they either had a storage unit right there or had a contract with one, now they're going to be having to earn, they also had really suppressed through these mechanisms the spread of prices in their market, even as they brought on massive amounts of renewables. So now they're going to have volatility in their energy prices like us, and the storage will have to play in those to make money, so that there's going to be a bit of a period of investment that has to catch up and figure out what that's going to look like. But they also have still a lot of other mechanisms of government support that are going to make sure it doesn't totally crater. But they do have this slower year coming up, just like we do, where next year, a lot of projects rush to get online at the end of 2025 so that they would not have to meet these requirements for not having too much of the cost come from China, right? These requirements for not having too much of the material cost for the project come from foreign entities of concern. So if they started construction by end of last year, they were fine. So basically all the projects that we think will come online in the US in 2026 are going to be projects that started last year. It normally takes about a year anyway for battery projects to get built. They will have started some projects as well that will come online in 2027. But as we get to 27 and into 28, that will start to run out. And so that's where we have North America here is the purple. That's mostly the US. Canada is a much smaller market, and Mexico. That lowest year for us is 27, where we really hit the point where we ran out of some of we don't have enough projects for what we could have otherwise built that were safe harbored, can use Chinese cells. We have domestic supply available, but it's not enough to fully cover the gap. Plus, everyone has to figure out, if they're going to use domestic supply, how they justify it to all these investment entities that are specializing around the ITC and decide that they believe that they have lined up the costs correctly, that they won't get in trouble from the IRS if they take on that tax credit. So that's going to get figured out. There's enough money behind it and enough manufacturing coming online here that there's going to be players doing that, but it's going to be a slow year in 27 and then pick back up as we need to really grow through the decade to meet that total demand, together with solar and wind and gas that we will have growing through this decade as well. So here we can see that although all segments are growing, utility scale continues to be the largest segment globally for storage through the next 10 years as well. And we'll sort of see how that varies by region in just a sec here. China keeping that very large share. There are some new markets that are emerging. The Middle East is one area we're looking very quickly. They're growing, especially Saudi Arabia. So this is the newest market, sort of in our top 10 markets around the world. They're signing for very large projects directly with Chinese suppliers at very low prices, and then building out storage to balance renewables that they're bringing online. And they're sort of experimenting as well with some campuses that are 100% renewable. Those, though, I think it was 20 times the power in storage duration. So 20 hours for one megawatt of load, they were installing 20 megawatt hours of storage, and I think it was 5 megawatts of solar. So it's like a kind of ratios if you really want to be 100% solar and storage that you need to go to, and that's in I believe it was Saudi Arabia as well, somewhere in the Middle East where there's very strong sun clearly most of the year. If you think about weathering the winter in Chicago, those ratios get even worse. So that's why, even as we get to very high percents of renewable modeling in any system, it's going to be a mix of assets that helps us get there. Okay, so this is where you can see that generally across the board, utility scale is the dominant sector around the world. Europe is the exception, where Germany really led the way on incentives that allowed for the build out of a lot of residential solar, even when it was very expensive, and that then created the need for residential storage and incentives around that. And so that's true in some other European countries as well, where we see that build out. But otherwise, utility scale storage has really dominated. It's much cheaper per installed power or energy, however you look at it. And as we get these large-scale grid renewable assets to balance, it's coming online. If we look at how, the duration in Europe, the grid scale storage has largely been installed for what we call ancillary services, balancing supply and demand at very quick timescales below the time step of the wholesale markets. And so that's why they could use shorter duration systems. That's very similar to what was being put into Texas as well, where you're sort of more just shifting solar around in the day. You get closer to a 4-hour duration. And then certain regions like Latin America, where they were incentivizing 6-hour storage with their procurements, we see even longer durations. Most of the storage projects in the US are owned by what we call IPPs, independent power producers. So, and then they sign a contract with the utility. Early on, utilities were signing, in like California, were signing to own the assets, and I think they decided they'd rather not operate them directly. They use the storage as a hedge against that growing volatility in their prices, but they let somebody else specialize in making sure it's still working and optimally bidding into the market. And we see, of course, the US has no storage target across the board. We'll look at some of the state ones, but other countries do have targets in place that is helping incentivize storage, and part of their plan for increasing renewables and getting towards their targets, potentially in their goals for the Paris Accords. But we're not hitting all of these targets. Just like you'll see on the states, we don't always hit those. So I'll dive in a little bit here to the US just to give you a taste of how this looks once you divide it out as a country across the board. So until now, the vast majority of projects have gone online in Texas and California. That is starting to shift, and over the next decade, we do expect it to become more diversified across the country. So this region here in the Midwest is the MISO power market. They're having, through time, as you install more solar, less of it is adding energy when the grid needs it at peak load, because you're creating that part of the day where you're just saturating the market with solar, and then there's not solar in the evening when people are coming home from work. And any solar that did overlap there eventually drowns out that edge of those hours. And so they need more capacity in their system. Renewables are counting for less towards that capacity that they can count on at peak load. And so they're seeing a build out of storage there, as well as retirements, although some of those retirements have been canceled now. So we'll see how some of that goes. But still building out for those reasons, as well as, now many of these regions are also where data centers are going in. New York has specific procurements that they're doing. They put in an incentive. They changed their rules for how their capacity market paid as well. And so then storage didn't really pencil anymore, and they had to put in a new mechanism to compensate it so that they would hit their target. We don't think they're going to hit their target on time, but they'll still get there within a couple years of that. Definitely helps it. So there are states that are putting in these policies both through a target, especially if they make it mandatory, and then back it up with an incentive mechanism or a state-run procurement where they're going to sign contracts and guarantee payments to the projects over time that are also helping, in addition to the growth of demand, to sort of backstop the projects that were already in development and the growth going forward, even given the federal changes that are happening. And then we can see sort of across the board, definitely the OBBA hurt solar and wind more than storage. And part of that is because storage kept the tax credit, given that it changes the supply outside of China. And even though that introduces some costs, as I said, there's a lot of factors sort of mitigating the cost increase from that once people navigate what those changes look like. And then additionally, any reduction that would have happened, in our view, got offset by the increasing demand that has sort of simultaneously happened to these policy changes, so holding it up. So that means that this is in megawatts, like the megawatts of storage that we expect to be installed went up. If you look at the percent of load that it represents, that would have gone down because some of it is due to that growth in load that is being met by a mix of assets, including storage. And then final point I just wanted to touch on is that, as I said, like 4-hour storage plus solar, not going to be a great way to be the exclusive asset in a grid. It's not going to create balance. The more renewables we get, the longer duration of storage we're going to need. So this is going back to those scenarios. On all of them, you have increasing renewables. So all of them through time, we see increasing duration of storage being deployed in those years, where net zero really being the highest, where you're still going to curtail renewables at a pretty significant level to get to that high level of renewable penetration, but you use longer and longer duration storage to lose less of it and weather through those low renewable periods that you might have, 5 days of very little sun in northern climates during a storm or things like that. There's a lot of different technologies here that are being explored. Some of them are taking off in China, like the vanadium flow batteries and CASE, but that is also partially due to just like government support. So we don't necessarily see which one is going to win out in the end here on pure economic terms, but based on largely that project pipeline in China where they're really investing in this and pushing it forward despite its higher cost than LFP cells, even at the same duration, those markets will grow. So we do see here the share of non-lithium systems growing to 15% over 10 years, but still a predominantly lithium-ion market. Okay, that was a lot of data, but I hope it was helpful in painting some of the broad picture around the world and a little bit of the details in the US here of what's driving the market, and I'm really excited to discuss whatever you guys want to talk about. Thanks.
Yeah, on the the shipping container storage, how much of that is being utilized for car batteries where the life of the car is over, but the battery still has some capacity in it?
Yeah, so I think there is currently, so we're still sort of at the very early stages. There's going to be a massive wave of EV batteries that come back and something needs to happen to them. There are not very many deployed in any capacity for ESS yet. And one of the main companies that is working on it, Redwood, which was founded by J.B. Straubel, who was a co-founder of Tesla, they're not going to put them in containers because it's very expensive to take apart the EV pack. It's like in there with liquid cooling systems that they made to like package it very tightly, in this certain shape in your car, and try to take out the cells and then repackage them and then put them in a container with AC and everything. That is likely not worth it given, as LFP has fallen down, cells are actually less and less a percent of the cost of the total system. So now they're well below 30%, I think. So what they're doing is they're just going to take the packs and they're going to level dirt and they're going to lay them in the dirt far enough apart that a forklift can drive around because they're all going to last different amounts of time. And then hook them up, and they made a fancy box that lets all the different packs work together and does all the talks to all the BMS systems to manage all the different cells and their voltage levels and everything, and do it that way. Just try to do sort of a large area, so not a very dense system that you would put really close to load in a city or something, but out in the desert. They're doing it out in the desert where they're not going to cool them either because they can't, you can't really reuse all those varied liquid cooling systems. But yeah, and see how that goes. I mean, they haven't deployed that at scale yet either. They have some examples that they've tried, like some demo sites that they say work, but yeah.
Thank you, that was so interesting. Going from global to local, what's Colorado doing? Specifically, I'm thinking Excel, our most local utility scale for storage. What's their plan looking like?
Yeah, I should have pulled that data. I don't have that. I'm trying to remember if I don't know if they're even in our table because I don't think they, it's New Mexico that has a mandate. I mean, we have a renewable energy standard that they have to reach, and so storage is going to be a part of how they do that. And I think they have run RFPs and procure projects. I don't know if I haven't looked at their IRPs recently to see what their planned build out is. We also sometimes do presentations with COSA, so I think I have a deck I made for them, so I can try to find it and pull it up later.
Okay, next question.
Yes, in one of your slides, you showed the levelized cost of energy for the different sources of gas and wind and solar. So given the intermittency of wind and solar, I wanted to kind of understand why storage is not typically integrated or embedded in there, because that typically is the cost associated with those technologies because of the difference of when when the supply is available and then when the demand is. So to really have an equalized kind of comparison, I wonder why storage is not kind of added into the other renewable sources.
Yeah, so one of those, sorry, I didn't call it out. One of these bars is hybrid, and that is a more expensive version of solar with 4-hour storage at half the power, which is sort of the common configuration for grid scale storage in the US. This isn't going to get you, like I said, 24-hour power, but this is the levelized cost of adding that 50% power, 4-hour storage to the solar system to shift some of it out of the midday. So that isn't that expensive. It's like, but there's a massive difference as if you increase that storage delta 20 times to get to what might, in a very sunny place, cover most hours, that's where it matters exactly what your target is for sort of how these play out.
Thanks for the presentation. Curious if you have a view on the future for C&I in particular, given the price pressures on electricity rates, especially on the demand and capacity charges. Is that going to be a sustained thing? Is that going to resolve over time, maybe with data centers increasing the volumetric consumption that then puts downward pressure? Do you have kind of a view on how that plays out?
C&I in the US has really failed to grow. It's been at about 200 megawatts for like 4 years. We keep forecasting it should grow like everything else, like resi has grown, like utility scale has grown. I think it's a really tough segment because the exact economics are so dependent on the combination of the load profile, whatever renewables they have, and the tariff, that it's like very complicated to market to, and it hasn't like been that paired with solar, like in the in resi. I mean, eventually, if storage gets cheap enough, that could change. We do have it, eventually grow because obviously, there's upward pressure on pricing more significantly now in the U.S. with load growth and the costs that we're putting on everything. But they're in the short term, very I think hurt by the FIOC changes. So that would be farther out. It does happen, and then it depends on how all the feed-in tariffs and stuff change too. Right? It really depends. We keep waiting for California to boom, but they keep having lingering NEM 2 projects. So,
hi, I had a question about like procurement of materials for building batteries, and obviously they come from the mining sector, but do you guys look at how advancements in the recycling industry for batteries are going to influence future supply?
The recycling has also been very slow. I mean, I think the volume of car packs coming back has been pretty low. I mean, Redwood says we haven't like, this was just like from their statements. We haven't done our own research on the recycling field to see if this is true, but they say something like they capture 90% or something of all lithium cells of any type coming back. The ones that are small, like from our laptops, they're just going to get the materials from, and then the packs they're going to evaluate for this ESS application. I mean, it's going to be, if they are the major player and they're like, it's like much easier to just like do this pack thing if that works out than to try to do the I mean, they're doing the recycling too, though, of everything else. But I think it's like hard enough and expensive enough that it seems like they're putting a huge emphasis on anything they could put just in the field as is without touching first. They want to do that.
Might you be able to share more about what you know about the natural gas plants? It seems like in the space of 2-3 years, prices just went up quite a lot, and the supply chain's constricted, or at least the demand increased. So I don't understand what was responsible for that. And the second part of that is, do you have any ideas how that may change in the next 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, so I think it was the change in trajectory of load. So, we were not building much gas. There's still a big risk that they become stranded assets, but there was especially, before. And now companies are ordering official orders are only for the next couple years, but they have informal sort of lines in place past that. Like, people are really saying they have to wait until like 2030, 2031 to get a turbine if they want one. I think people are paying to swap places in line and things because the hyperscalers are willing to pay so much. But it's also, because the data centers are now at this large scale, like a gigawatt size, you don't want to install a gigawatt of diesel generators for backup. So to the extent that they do want to back them up still, which is probably on average less for some of these than that, like 99.9%, like definitely want to cover it all the power all the time. But they are still going to want backup. They're doing that with turbines also. So, there's a shortage now of like the turbines that move around to support like fracking, like power generation. They're really just pulling any possible, used airplane turbine. I think people are investigating all possible options because it's become so desperate for any kind of power to build now and be faster than your competitor who is also building out data centers, and you need to train your model first or be the first one to provide it to the hyperscalers to get their business.
Oh, thank you. Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. Kind of a different question. Recently, I attended a utility conference, and they were kind of falling all over themselves, one-upmanship of how this massive amount of storage that they're installing. And but one of the concerns was that they emphasized 100% that this was all standalone storage, not connected with solar and wind. And the question was, well then, is solar and wind going to be charging those batteries? And the answer was, kind of avoiding the question, whatever resource is the cheapest and most available. And of course the concern is, is it going to be gas and coal plants at night that are not being used, that type of thing. And so that was a concern. Have you had a chance to look at that and see if that's an issue? They mentioned a lot about, of course, data centers and being able to charge those at, off peak. And of course, the goal is to reduce that peak and be of financial benefit to everybody. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, batteries themselves are, neutral. So, they're actually net, right, losing energy because they're inefficient, so they cost energy. In where a lot of standalone storage has gone in is in Texas. I think it is large, the prices that get very low there are because of renewables. I think it's still generally charged on renewables. It's not maybe exclusively the case because, it's, all the wind and solar that went in West Texas is what's making the lows. I think and then in California, they're shifting, the midday out. So I think it's still going to be generally pretty low emission charging. It's not, by the system we have where we don't put any carbon pricing in the market, it's not guaranteed. That's something we could fix if we wanted to, but we probably won't. I think probably they're positioning, they're trying to distance, themselves from renewables at this stage to make sure the problem with ones that are paired, I mean, generally we look at the storage being added to balance the renewables, and their role in replacing retirements has to be with something to make the energy, which we typically consider like solar. The ones that are built with renewables right now in the West, I don't know what region these utilities were in, but we're facing really big permitting risks on the renewable projects in the West right now. Even if they're not on federal land, a lot of the projects still require a federal permit, and those are really held up right now. So there are some ways that it's much safer to build a standalone project right now.
One thing I have read, I believe, in one of my Bill McKibben's books, was that Apple has 4 data centers that are basically battery, solar plus storage. Is that something that has come across your desk also?
Yeah, I don't know if I know about those in particular. I mean, there are, I know of one project that was really trying to be 100% that solar plus storage. It's a question on Google's goal is 24/7. It is matching the shape of their renewable generation to their load, but it's sort of exactly how tightly you enforce it. And are you grid connected at all? And if you are you saying you're doing that under 24/7 every single day, every possible weather year and scenario, or are you relying on the grid for some of that? And so then that dramatically, like I said, changes really the size of that solar plus storage and how expensive it's going to be. But there are campuses that are being designed to be primarily powered by renewables. So we'll sort of see what balance people strike on it. Yeah, I know of very few that are really meant to be more off-grid, 100% solar plus storage, because it just gets so crazy, unless they're willing to just turn them off sometimes.
Thank you. Is there any concept on using EVs for battery storage also? I mean, it's for I guess load leveling, and then are there any other concepts in batteries that are coming out that are not lithium, that are heavy and you never have to move them? Because it seems like the lithiums are really, it's their energy density which makes them so popular. Yeah.
There is, vehicle to grid. I mean, you can either do it like I looked at in my PhD, where you just control how you charge the vehicles to be part of a grid service. I think, VPPs and aggregation is expanding. Octopus came over from UK over here and is trying to get into that market. And is it Base Energy? Or there's another big VPP company trying to emerge in Texas. I don't recall their name now, but yeah. So, and controlled charging of electric vehicles or vehicles to grid could be part of that. It hasn't been super economic yet. I mean, you pay a lot to package up the battery and put it in a car. And so if you're doing a bunch of just daily extra cycling and it reduces your car in any noticeable way, like its life, that it's useful to you, or its range and how that interplay, I think those economics aren't super great. I think, but as batteries get cheaper, it gets closer. And then, of course, for backup, I think there's a huge amount, backup, people pay way, way more, as I recently learned, than you would for just daily cycling. Oh, you can lose this part of your car's life and that's why I looked at it. It was if you went from charging on peak to off peak, you could maybe pay people $100 a year in PJM at the time. I was like, if that was at all noticeable to you on how much you could use your car, would you really take that $100 a year? Probably not. So, yeah, we'll get more. And then what was the other question? Oh, the density. Yeah. So the reason we still have so much LFP being used is that it's still just the cheapest per kilowatt at the given durations that we're incentivizing in the markets, which is really no more than 8 hours and mostly more like 4 hours. That's what's mostly paid for full capacity in markets right now. That's going to be, you're going to need to have longer duration to go past that. But even at 8 hours, LFP is cheaper than flow batteries, cheaper than Ks. So that's why it's still winning, as we need much longer than that. The 100-hour space, those companies aren't quite as far along. Form is, I think, very closer to doing their first like 1.5 megawatts, so just really small, but first 100-hour project, and there's some other companies trying to do 100-hour type durations. We'll need that eventually. It's not at all incentivized in the market yet.
Hi, you have such a unique vantage point of seeing a global market and how batteries fit into that, and you have niche expertise in batteries. If you could ignore the market, if you could wave your magic wand, and you could decide how batteries fit into renewable energy and how batteries fit into our global goals or whatever goals are important to you, what would that look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we would need is, our current markets for these utility scale projects play in are marginal cost markets where the price is set by whatever unit is most expensive at that time. And so it kind of like relies on some expensive gas being there, setting high prices that make it worth the battery to charge at one time and discharge at another time. And so we kind of get into a problem as we have more and more just renewables and storage, that whole market structure like not really working. So I think we're gonna need some mechanism to just incentivize different durations of storage that help deal with these different timescales of balancing that you have to do with renewables across, the 5-minute rapid ramps that happen, but not at huge powers, and then the seasonal imbalances and other, and everything in between.
So there are several lithium mining projects planned in the U.S., and as those come online, how much will that impact the economics of domestically manufactured batteries, and have you incorporated that in your projections?
Yeah, so for domestic manufacturing, there's a bunch of steps that we have to work through for bringing the supply chain here. The first step that we've made significant progress, but still have a big gap, is the cell manufacturing. And so that, we need about 100 gigawatt hours a year by 2030 for just ESS. So sort of ignore the EV part, which is much bigger, but, and we might be able to meet that, or our base cases were more like a third of that being made here. To meet the FIAC requirements, the cell definitely can't come from China, but you also can't have both the anode and the cathode come from China, probably, if they haven't defined the rules below the level of the cell, but if they define them at all based on what we think the cost ratios are in real life, then you can't have both come from China. And about 97% of LFPs cathodes are made in China, and the other 3% are probably made by Chinese-owned companies, so it doesn't help anyway. There's like a very small supply of that growing in some in the Middle East and other places, and then the anodes are also heavily made in China. So it's like those components need to be sorted out, and then you have the processed lithium. Most of that is made in China. The raw lithium mining, that's, as you go further and further up, it's a lower % of the cost, so it becomes less critical that individual part comes from China. So if they mine it here, they ship it to China for processing, it comes, and then make it into a cathode, and then it comes here. So, it could still help, but it's, not the piece we're most concerned about now. It's like cell manufacturing, because there's so much excess EV manufacturing that was built up that can be switched over. That's what LG, the big manufacturer, so far of domestic cells here for ESS has done, was switch a EV plant over and then expand it. And they're gonna try to get to about 26 gigawatt hours a year themselves. So like the cell could do it if people want it and they spend the time and money, but it's really those cell components that we're worried about next.
You had a slide about the various technologies and how they compare in terms of how they develop. I was surprised to see that the projection for the sodium batteries was pretty conservative. Because right now everybody's screaming, sodium, sodium. What about it?
Yes, so there's one announced pipeline, a project, right? So Jupiter signed a deal where one battery will be built with sodium ion, and then they have the option to use it for the rest of their 5 gigawatt pipeline. but our forecast on that split globally is really predominated by the Chinese pipelines of projects being built out. So I think if there's rapid ramp up in the US, there's definitely room for that to increase beyond the 5% or so that we had it at. That number is largely China. We don't forecast that sodium's really going to cross over in cost with lithium. So I think it's more of a supply chain hedge for FIAC restrictions is why they did it.
I see a lot of uncertainty from market forces in the penetration of storage. What about just the aspects of the storage technology itself? What's the biggest driver of uncertainty? It's got to be price, right? Is there anything else that is really high up there in the technical aspects of battery driving uncertainties of your projection of penetration?
Yeah, I think it's price and like when and if any of these long duration technologies like cross over to per kilowatt level. We are continually too high on our price forecasts. Like LFP fell much faster than we expected from just like learning rates of the early years. I think just from the immense manufacturing ramp and pressure in China. Every time we like look back, we have to like lower our curve. And eventually there will be some, we don't see what it is yet. We're just sort of surveying the technologies out there. We're not deep in the weeds of any labs in particular. Our long-term forecast has sort of, not in the 10 years as much, but as we look out to 2050, 2060, when we, for the build out that we do for the power price modeling, and we have to look that further out, we are incorporating additional declines for the sort of average expectation of some new chemistry coming in and being cheaper, but we don't know really exactly when or what that will be.
So the one graph, it looked like, just to use vernacular here, it kind of looked like China was kicking the U.S.'s butt pretty much with regard to rolling out storage and also with regard to pricing and things like that as well. So I was very curious when, that piqued my interest when you said that all the time under the Trump administration when the other incentives are going away, solar and wind and that actually it is being kept on battery storage to keep those incentives to get that away from China. Is that really true? And the other thing is, I know we talked in another presentation here about kind of the pre-processing of the lithium batteries versus the big facility. After the pre-processing, it goes to the big facility for recycling, and China has that right now, and the U.S. does not. And I was just wondering if there's any environmental effects of having one here.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be more expensive for us to do if we at all uphold, our normal or previous environmental standards. I think it's just this, because the pressure hasn't come back yet of the packs retiring from a large number of vehicles. It's just battery recycling isn't that far along yet here or in Europe. And then on the regulations, I think there was a concerted effort by some of the organizations that support renewable and storage development to keep, because it was known that renewables were such a target, to try to keep storage in a separate category as this dispatchable option that could be part of the picture with gas for balancing and meeting large loads, and the picture that the administration might buy more into, and not being inherently green in any way per se. And then, it is also like a technology that is earlier in its development, and it has gotten dramatically down the cost curve by now, so I don't know if there's like a super strong argument that it still needed the incentives, especially as we see it could be competitive without them from China compared to the cost here. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a part that we were already Biden also increased the tariffs on battery components batteries coming from China. So we have been, even under the IRA, trying to incentivize that manufacturing to start here. And this is, I think, going to be a big force really ramping that up faster than it would have otherwise under just the IRA.
There's one aspect that makes a lot of people think about getting home storage, namely the increasing blackouts and brownouts that we're getting. And I'm not sure I remember from your presentation whether you made any predictions about a possible explosion of the home storage market.
Yeah, we do have a higher growth rate on residential than like C&I. And part of it is, I mean, they're both helped by some similar, right? Like when California changed, it changed for both C&I and resi, where it stopped paying as much for the solar you feed into the grid. That motivates storage on both fronts. The economics are just like a little simpler on resi, and now residential storage will keep the ITC if you don't own it yourself, which is kind of interesting. But third-party owners that you lease from can take that investment tax credit. And then, yeah, we think there is growing demand for blackout protection, and that is part of our residential forecast.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering, Trump is out to kneecap the entire renewable industry, more or less battery storage, renewable generation, all the above. Do you keep a temperature at what point the energy supply in the United States may not necessarily crash, but take a very hard backseat? And what would be the temperature for a future global conflict when China is really leading the game at this point?
I'm not sure I have a full answer to that. I mean, even with the changes and, we had that, decrease in solar and wind build out, we still and we have the limits on, there's 70 gigawatts of turbines made around the world and how many we think can come to the US for gas. Like, we still think we're going to be able to get to a picture that solves in the United States. Prices will go up, scarcity events will go up. There's increasing pressure on capacity markets. Like, things will get more difficult, but we don't think it's, not a feasible solution. We've just made it more expensive for ourselves. I mean, there's always the risk that something like dramatically more trade, restrictions go into place and things get even worse. Yeah. Yes, right. So like I said, like the state policies are helping hold up the markets as well. The demand is making sure that something gets built.
It looks like we've come to the natural end of this formal part of the evening. I would like to thank Allison very much for this presentation, and you are welcome. And you're welcome to bug her a little more during our reception. The reception is free, but I did put out a basket in case you want to chip in. What we would prefer even more if some people could consider becoming a member of the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. We don't get many business members, so we depend on people who pay an annual fee to support our work.